The air inside the hallway of the Grand City Auditorium felt thick, heavy, and smelled like floor wax and expensive perfume. It was the kind of place where people whispered, instead of talking, where every step echoed on the polished marble floors. 7-year-old Maya sat on a hard plastic chair near the wall, her legs dangling several inches above the ground. She was swinging them back and forth, a slow rhythm that was the only movement in a hallway frozen with stress. Around her, the atmosphere was sharp with tension. The hallway was packed with older kids getting ready for the big competition. There were teenage girls in long, dark velvet dresses that looked like they cost more than Maya's parents made in a month. Their hair was pulled back tight, making them look serious and grown up. There were boys in crisp white shirts and black jackets, standing with their arms crossed, staring at the floor or running their fingers rapidly in the air, practicing invisible music. Maya looked like a small, colorful bird that had accidentally flown into a cave of serious gray statues. She was wearing a simple dress. It had small pink flowers on it, and the sleeves were a little too short, exposing her wrists to the cold air of the hallway. Her mother had bought it secondhand from a thrift store last week, washing it 3 times to make sure it looked bright and clean for today. To Maya, it was her best dress. To the people around her, it looked out of place. She watched the other contestants with wide, curious eyes. She didn't feel the nervousness that everyone else seemed to have. She was just excited to be near the big piano she had seen from the window. Next to her, a tall boy who looked about 15 was pacing back and forth. He was holding a thick stack of sheet music, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages. He stopped for a moment and noticed Maya looking at him. He frowned, looking down at the small girl with the messy hair and the scuffed shoes. "Are you lost?" he asked. His voice wasn't mean, but it wasn't kind either. It was the voice of someone who thinks you are in the way. Maya shook her head quickly. "No, I am number 43, she said softly. The boy let out a short, sharp laugh. "Number 43. That's the junior division finals," he said, looking around as if he was looking for her parents. "This is for serious players, kid. Where is your music folder?" Maya patted the small pocket of her dress. "I know my song by heart," she said. The boy rolled his eyes so hard it looked like it hurt. He turned away, muttering something under his breath about people wasting the judge's time. He went back to pacing, ignoring her completely. Maya didn't let it bother her. She was used to it. At school, the other kids liked to run around and play tag, but Maya always preferred to sit in the corner during recess and listen to the music teacher play. The old upright piano in the gym. They called her Quiet Maya, or sometimes just the weird girl. She didn't mind the quiet. The quiet was where the music lived in her head. Her mother, Alara, was standing a few feet away near the water fountain. She looked more nervous than Maya. Alara was wearing her work uniform because she hadn't had time to change. After her morning shift at the diner, she was twisting a small paper napkin in her hands, her knuckles white. She looked at the other parents' mothers with pearl necklaces, and fathers checking expensive watches on their wrists, and she shrank back a little. Alara had noticed. The way the other competitors looked at her daughter, they saw a small child in a faded dress. They saw a distraction. They didn't see the hours. They didn't see Maya sitting on the carpet in their small living room at night, using an old, chipped keyboard that had missing keys. They didn't hear the music she made with the headphones plugged in, playing so softly so she wouldn't wake her baby brother. "Mom, can I have a drink of water?" Maya asked, breaking her mother's trance. Alara jumped a little. "Yes, sweetheart." "Just a sip." Maya hopped off the chair. Her shoes made a squeaky sound on the floor as she walked to the fountain. As she bent down to drink, a woman with a sharp voice walked by, leading a girl who looked terrified. "I don't know why they let just anyone enter," the woman was saying loudly, clearly not caring who heard. "It lowers the prestige of the event when little children come to play games. This is a competition, not a playground." The woman walked right past Alara, brushing her shoulder. Alara didn't say anything. She just watched her daughter. She knew that Maya wasn't playing a game. She knew that music was the only thing that made Maya's eyes light up like stars. But looking at the scene around her, the expensive instruments, The professional teachers, the stiff postures. Laura felt a cold knot in her stomach. She wondered if she had done the wrong thing by bringing Maya here. Maybe they were just a joke to these people. Maya finished drinking and skipped back to her chair. She didn't notice the whispers or the judgmental looks. Her mind was already humming the song she was going to play. In her head, the song wasn't just notes on a page. It was a story. It was about a storm that turns into sunshine and then rain again. She felt the rhythm in her chest, steady and strong. A loud voice boomed over the crackly speaker system, making everyone jump. Number 42. Please proceed to the stage wing. The tall boy who had been pacing stopped. He took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the heavy double doors that led to the stage. He looked confident, ready. A few people clapped him on the back as he passed. That left Maya. She was next. The hallway emptied out a little as people moved toward the doors to watch. But many stayed behind, using the time to frantically review their scores or fix their hair. A man holding a camera walked by, looking for someone important to interview. He scanned the room, and his eyes slid right over Maya. Dismissing her instantly as someone's little sister who was waiting in the hall, Maya looked up at her mother. Is it my turn soon? Ilara nodded, forcing a smile. Yes, baby, very soon. Are you scared? Maya thought about it. She touched the pocket of her dress, where she had put a small, lucky stone she found in the garden that morning.
No, Maya said.
The piano doesn't care how old I am. It just wants to be played. A woman standing nearby, who was tightening a ribbon on a girl's hair, heard this. She let out a soft, mocking snort. Cute, she whispered to the girl. Maybe she will play chopsticks for us. Maya didn't hear the whisper. Her focus was entirely on the big red curtain at the end of the hall. She could hear the faint sound of the boy playing number 42. It was fast and precise. He played perfectly, but to Maya, it sounded like he was doing math homework. It didn't sound like a story. The applause from the audience inside the hall drifted through the heavy doors. It was polite, standard applause. The boy had done a good job. Maya took a deep breath. She squeezed her hands together, stretching her small fingers. She had played on a keyboard for so long that she sometimes forgot what real ivory keys felt like. She imagined the weight of the keys, the way they bounced back against your fingertips. Number 43, the voice on the speaker called out. Maya Ilara reached down and gently brushed a stray hair out of Maya's face. Go show them, Maya, she whispered. Maya stood up. She was small. The chair she had been sitting on seemed huge now that she was standing. She smoothed down the front of her flowered dress. The hallway seemed to grow silent as she walked past the remaining competitors. They stopped their whispering and their pacing to watch her go. It was like watching a toddler walk toward a cliff edge. They were waiting for her to turn back, to cry, or for an adult to swoop in and carry her away. But Maya didn't look back. She walked with a strange, quiet dignity, her head held high, her eyes fixed on the light coming from under the heavy stage doors. To them, she was a distraction. To her mother, she was a miracle. But to Maya, she was just a girl who had a song inside her that was getting too loud to keep in any longer. She pushed the heavy door open, and the noise of the hall faded away as she stepped into the darkness of the wings, leaving the doubt behind her. The transition from the hallway to the backstage area was like stepping from a noisy, bright street into a dark, quiet library. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind Maya, cutting off the sounds of people whispering and pacing. Suddenly, the only thing she could hear was the beating of her own heart, which felt like a tiny drum thumping against her ribs. A man wearing a headset and holding a clipboard looked down from his high stool. He looked tired, like he had been standing there for 100 years. He checked his paper, looked at Maya, and then looked at the paper again. You're 43? He asked, raising one eyebrow. Maya nodded. Yes, sir. He stared at her for a second, then sighed. Okay. Wait until the red light turns off, then go. And try not to trip on the cable. He pointed to a thick black wire running across the floor. It looked like a snake sleeping on the carpet. Maya stepped over it carefully. She could hear the judges talking on the other side of the thick velvet curtain. They were speaking in low, serious voices. Number 42 was technically proficient, a woman's voice said. It sounded cold and sharp, like ice cracking on a puddle, but a bit mechanical. "We need to see some passion. Let's get this over with," a deep male voice grumbled. "The schedule is running late." Maya stood very still. The air backstage was dusty and smelled like old wood. She looked down at her hands. They were so small. She looked at her fingers, wondering if they would be strong enough to push the keys down. The piano in the living room at home had light keys that were easy to press. She knew the pianos on stage were different. Her mother had told her they were heavy and loud, like sleeping lions that you had to wake up gently. Suddenly, the red light on the wall clicked off. A green light turned on. The man with the clipboard said, waving his hand toward the curtain. Maya took a deep breath. She felt a funny feeling in her stomach, like she had just gone over the top of a hill on a roller coaster. But she wasn't scared. She was ready. She reached out and pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain. It felt warm and soft under her fingers. As she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights hit her face. They were so bright that she couldn't see the audience at all. It was like looking into the sun. She knew there were hundreds of people out there in the dark, but right now, it looked like she was standing alone on a floating island of light in front of her. Sitting in the center of the stage was the biggest piano Maya had ever seen. It was shiny and black, reflecting the spotlights like a mirror. It looked magnificent. It looked terrifying. The lid was propped open, showing off the gold strings inside. Maya began to walk toward the bench. Because her legs were short, her steps were quick and light. Click, 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 went her shoes on the wooden floor. To the people sitting in the darkness, the sound was small and lonely. It sounded like a little bird hopping on a roof. In the audience, the mood changed immediately. When the tall boy walked out, the room was silent with respect. But when Maya appeared, a low murmur rippled through the rows of seats. People leaned forward, squinting their eyes. "Is that a child?" Someone whispered loudly from the balcony. "It looks like she got lost," a woman whispered a few rows back. There were a few giggles. Not mean giggles, but confused giggles. The people in the expensive clothes and the jewelry felt uncomfortable. They had paid good money to see a serious competition, and now a little girl in a flowered dress was walking onto the stage. It felt like a mistake. They looked around for security or for a teacher to come out and grab her. Maya kept her eyes on the piano. She didn't look out at the dark seats. She focused on the shiny black curve of the instrument. She climbed the 3 steps up to the platform and stood in front of the bench. This was the hardest part. The bench was set at the perfect height for an adult. For Maya, it was like trying to sit at a table designed for a giant. She tried to sit down, but her feet dangled nowhere near the floor. There was a creaking sound as she pulled the bench forward a little bit. She had to hop up twice to get her bottom high enough. Then she had to scoot forward until her toes just barely brushed the pedals. She couldn't reach them properly to pump them, so she would have to use her hands to change the sound. Or just play very carefully. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It was the sound of people relaxing because they thought this was going to be a joke. They thought she was going to play a nursery rhyme. They adjusted their glasses and settled back into their seats, ready to be cute and entertained. On the judges' table, the woman with the cold voice, Mrs. Gable, looked at her watch. She let out a loud, exaggerated sigh that echoed slightly in the quiet hall. She picked up her pen and tapped it on the table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a sound that said, "Hurry up. I am bored." The male judge next to her shook his head slowly. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at the tiny figure struggling with the bench. Maya heard the giggles. She heard the tapping pen. For a second, her hand hovered over the keys. She felt a hot flash of embarrassment in her cheeks. She knew she looked funny. She knew she didn't belong here. But then she remembered what her mother had told her that morning. The piano doesn't care how old you are. Maya set her jaw in a firm line. She sat up as straight as she could. She pulled her sleeves up slightly, exposing her small wrists. She placed her left hand on the low notes and her right hand on the high notes. She took a second to feel the coldness of the ivory. It felt solid. It felt real. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She blocked out the giggles. She blocked out the tapping pen. She imagined she was back in the living room, safe and warm. The audience fell quiet, waiting for the first simple note. They expected a light, childish plink. Instead, Maya took a deep breath and pushed down. The sound that came out wasn't a plink. It was a roar. She struck a chord with both hands, using the weight of her small shoulders to press the keys all the way down. A deep, rich, and powerful C minor chord filled the entire auditorium. It hung in the air like a storm cloud, vibrating in everyone's chests. The laughing stopped instantly. The tapping pen froze in midair. The girl in the balcony leaned forward so fast she almost spilled her drink. The sound was so big, so full of sadness and anger, that it didn't seem possible it could come from such a small child. The joke was over. The room realized in a single heartbeat that they had made a terrible mistake. The sound of that first chord seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud, refusing to fade away. It vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the judges' table, and straight into the chests of everyone sitting in the dark. It wasn't the sound of a child practicing. It was the sound of a storm breaking. Before anyone could even take a breath, Maya moved. Her hands didn't just press the keys. They attacked them, danced over them, and loved them all at the same time. She was playing Chopin's Fantasy impromptu, a song that is famous for being incredibly difficult. It requires the left hand to play a slow, steady rhythm while the right hand moves like lightning, playing a waterfall of fast notes. Most people who try to play this song sound like they are struggling to climb a mountain. They sound mechanical and stiff. But Maya didn't sound like she was climbing. She sounded like she was flying. Her small hands were a blur of motion. The right hand moved so fast it looked like it had 6 fingers instead of 5, creating a shimmering wave of high notes that sparkled like rain on a window pane. Underneath that rain, her left hand played deep, heavy notes that sounded like the heartbeat of the earth. The audience froze. The confusion from a moment ago vanished, replaced instantly by a shock that felt like a splash of cold water. The man, who had whispered that she looked lost, stopped checking his phone. His hand slowly lowered to his lap, his mouth falling open slightly. The silence in the room was different now. Before, it was a waiting silence, an impatient silence. Now, it was a silence of total amazement. No one coughed. No one rustled their candy wrappers. No one looked at their watch. Hundreds of people were leaning forward in their seats, captivated by the small girl in the flowered dress. On the stage, Maya was in a different world. She couldn't see the audience anymore. The bright lights had blinded her to everything except the black and white keys. Her eyes were closed tight, her eyebrows scrunched together in a look of deep concentration. She was swaying slightly back and forth, feeling the rhythm flow from her head, down her neck, and out through her fingertips. She didn't feel like a 7-year-old girl on a high bench. She felt tall. She felt powerful. Every time she struck a key, she let out a little bit of the energy she had been holding inside for so long. She thought about the long days at school where she felt invisible. She thought about the way people looked at her old shoes. She put all those feelings into the music. The fast parts were her running, free and happy. The loud, strong chords were her shouting to the world that she was there. The piano, which had been a sleeping lion just moments ago, was now fully awake. It roared under her hands. The sound was filling every corner of the huge auditorium, bouncing off the high ceilings and the velvet curtains. It was a sound so big that it seemed impossible it was coming from someone who couldn't even reach the pedals. Up at the judges' table, Mrs. Gable had stopped tapping her pen. It was suspended in midair, but her hand wasn't moving. She was a woman who had heard thousands of students play piano. She had heard prodigies, she had heard professors, and she had heard experts. She knew every trick in the book. She knew when someone was playing with talent and when they were just playing with technique. But this was different. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. She looked at the stage, really looked at it, trying to find the trick. Was there a hidden track? Was the piano player by remote control? No. She could see Maya's shoulders rising and falling with the effort. She could see the small feet dangling, kicking slightly in time with the music. Mrs. Gable felt a strange, prickling sensation in her nose and eyes. She blinked, confused. It was just a piano song, she told herself. It was just notes on a page, but there was so much emotion in it. It sounded like a person crying and laughing at the same time. It sounded raw and real, not polished and perfect, like the students she usually praised. It was messy and beautiful. She put her pen down. She realized she wouldn't need to write any notes about posture or hand position for this girl. None of that mattered. The music was speaking for itself. The piece was long and difficult. Maya's fingers were starting to hurt a little. Her arms were tired from reaching up to the keys. But she didn't want to stop. She was scared that if she stopped, the magic would go away, and she would just be a little girl on a chair again. So she pushed harder, jumping into the hardest part of the song where the notes come so fast they almost run into each other. In the 10th row, a mother holding her daughter's hand squeezed it tight. The daughter, who was also a piano student, was staring at the stage with tears running down her face. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she knew, deep down, that she would never be able to play like that. She realized that Maya wasn't just playing the notes. Maya was living them. Even the older teenagers, the ones who had laughed at Maya in the hallway backstage, were watching from the wings. They had peeked through the heavy curtains to see her make a fool of herself. Now they were frozen, their instruments forgotten. The boy who had called the song childish felt his face turn red with shame. He looked at his own hands, hands that were much bigger than Maya's, and he felt weak. He realized that talent doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about how tall you are or how nice your clothes are. The music filled the hall like a rising tide. It washed away the judgment, the arrogance, and the doubt. Grand City Auditorium wasn't a place for rich people to show off their diamonds and their fancy clothes. It was a place where a human soul was pouring itself out, raw and naked. For everyone to see, Maya hit a series of high, sharp notes that pierced through the air like a needle. The sound was so clear and perfect that it gave people goosebumps on their arms. She transitioned back to the deep, heavy bass, her little fist pounding the low keys with a force that made the piano rock slightly on its wheels. She was sweating now. A small bead of sweat rolled down her temple and hung from her chin, but she didn't wipe it away. She was too busy. She was flying. She was fighting. She was winning. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Everyone was connected by the sound, tied together by the melody of a 7-year-old girl who just wanted to be heard. And for the first time that day, she wasn't just background noise. She was the loudest thing in the world. The storm of fast, chaotic notes began to slow down. Maya's hands, which had been moving like frightened birds, suddenly calmed. The thunder and the bass stopped, and the rain and the trebles softened. The music was moving into its middle section. It's the part where the song stops fighting and starts to remember. This was the slower, sadder part of the piece. It required a gentle touch, a softness that was harder to master than speed. Maya leaned closer to the keys, her nose almost touching the fallboard. She wasn't reading music anymore. She was listening to the sound she was creating, letting it guide her fingers. The melody that floated out into the auditorium was heartbreakingly beautiful. It was simple and pure, singing a lonely song in a huge, empty room. The sound seemed to hang in the air like a golden thread, connecting the stage to the very back row of the balcony. In the audience, the spell wasn't broken, but it changed. People who had been leaning forward in shock now slowly settled back into their seats, their eyes getting wet. The music wasn't just impressive anymore. It was personal. It was touching a place inside them that they didn't let anyone see. An old man in the 4th row, who had come to the competition because his daughter was playing later, felt a sudden lump in his throat. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't in a fancy hall. He was back in his childhood, sitting on a porch swing, listening to his mother hum while she worked in the garden. He felt a deep sense of longing for a time that was gone forever. He opened his eyes and saw the tiny girl on the stage, and he realized that she was playing that feeling for him. She was playing the feeling of missing something you can never get back. Next to him, a younger woman was crying openly. She wasn't making a sound, but the tears were streaming down her cheeks and ruining her makeup. She had spent years taking piano lessons, forcing herself to practice scales and arpeggios until she hated the sound of the piano. She had quit because it felt like work. But watching Maya, she realized she had never actually listened. She had never felt the music like this. She felt a sharp pang of regret, wondering if she had given up on something magical to Isley. On stage, Maya felt a sudden peace wash over her. The first part of the song had been full of energy, like running as fast as she could. But this part was like floating. She played a high note that rang out like a bell, clear and bright. She held it, letting the sound fade until it was just a whisper, because she couldn't reach the pedals to sustain the sound. She had to be very careful. She had to hold the keys down just long enough, balancing the note perfectly before letting it go. It made her playing even more delicate. She was crafting every sound by hand, sculpting the silence as much as the noise. Back in the wings, the hallway was completely silent. The teenagers who had been warming up had stopped. The arrogant boy who had rolled his eyes was standing perfectly still, his sheet music crumpled in his hand. He was listening, really listening, for the first time in his life. He realized that all the technical skill he had practiced his fast fingers, his perfect posture meant nothing if he didn't have this feeling. He looked at Maya's small back and realized that she was a giant. And he was the one who was small. Maya's mother, Alara, was standing in the shadows, her hands covering her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She knew that her daughter was special, but she had never heard her sound like this. Usually, Maya played with a smile on her face. Today, she played with a seriousness that broke her mother's heart. It sounded like Maya was pouring all her secrets into the piano, the secrets of being the poor kid. The quiet kid, the kid who didn't fit in. It was the sound of loneliness, but it was also the sound of hope. The auditorium was so quiet now that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling, but mostly you could hear the silence between the notes. Maya would play a soft chord, lift her hand, and let the room breathe. In that silence, you could hear hundreds of people thinking their own private thoughts. A man sitting near the front, music teacher who had judged dozens of competitions, took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes, which were stinging. He had spent his life teaching students how to play correctly. He taught them where to put their thumbs, how to curve their fingers, how to count the beats. But he knew, in that moment, that he couldn't teach this. He couldn't teach someone to play with their soul. Maya had it naturally. It was a gift, but it was also a burden. It was clear that she felt everything deeply, perhaps too deeply, for a 7-year-old. The music swelled again, moving toward the climax. Maya's left hand began to play rolling waves of notes, while her right hand climbed higher and higher, creating a feeling of growing tension. It was the feeling of wanting to break free. It was the feeling of looking at the sky and wanting to fly. The audience held its collective breath. They weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were on a journey. They were feeling Maya's feelings. They weren't judging her dress or her size. They saw past the exterior of a small child and saw the spirit inside her. The little girl on the bench had vanished. In her place was a force of nature. She was playing with a passion that was terrifying and wonderful all at once. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the prize or the people watching. She was thinking about the song and how much she loved it. She was giving the song everything she had, pouring her heart out onto the black and white keys and the crowd. The critics, the parents, and the judges, they were drinking it in. They were hungry for this kind of truth. In a world where people were often fake and polite, this raw honesty was shocking. It was healing. It made them feel human again. As the melody reached its peak, Maya's face scrunched up, not in pain, but in effort. She wanted the last few notes before the finale to be perfect. She wanted them to sing. She struck the keys with a firm, gentle hand, and the notes rang out, pure and true. They hung in the air for what felt like a lifetime. Then her hands lifted off the keyboard. The sudden silence that followed was louder than any noise they had heard all day. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full. It was vibrating with the memory of the music. The audience sat there, stunned, unable to move or speak. They were living in that moment, afraid that if they clapped too soon, the magic would disappear. They wanted to stay in the feeling she had given them just a little longer. Maya sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her chest heaving up and down, waiting for the room to come back to life. The silence that filled the Grand City Auditorium was heavy and thick. It was the kind of silence that feels like a weight pressing on your chest. Maya sat on the bench, her hands resting quietly in her lap, staring at the black and white keys. Her chest was moving up and down fast. She was out of breath, just like she had run a long race. The last notes of the song were still floating in the air, ghost-like and soft, fading away into the high ceiling of the hall. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the entire audience was frozen in ice. The music had been so powerful that no one wanted to be the first person to make a noise and break the spell. They were afraid that if they clapped too soon, the magic would vanish, and they would just be back in a dusty old building. The man in the 4th row kept his eyes closed, holding on to the memory of the melody for 1 second longer. The woman who had been crying wiped her cheek, but she didn't move. Maya didn't know what to think. Her heart was beating so hard, she could hear it in her ears. She wondered if she had made a mistake. Did she stop too soon? Did she play the wrong note at the end? The stage lights were still shining in her eyes, so she couldn't see the faces of the people in the dark. She just saw blackness. In the awkward quiet, a small wave of panic started to rise in her throat. She felt very small again and very alone on that big stage. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It wasn't a cough or a whisper. It was the sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Mrs. Gable, the judge who had been tapping her pen and checking her watch just minutes ago, had stood up. She didn't say a word. She just stood there in the darkness, looking at the stage. That was the spark. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the entire room exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. It started from the front rows and rushed backward like a tidal wave hitting the beach. People leaped to their feet. They weren't just clapping. They were shouting, "Bravo!" Someone screamed. "Amazing!" cried a voice from the balcony. The sound was deafening. It washed over Maya like a warm wind. She blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. As she looked out, she saw a wall of people standing up. The teenagers who had laughed at her in the hallway were clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The boy who had rolled his eyes was standing with his mouth open, clapping slowly, looking at her with total respect. Maya felt a shock run through her body. They weren't laughing. They were cheering for her. Her face broke into a wide, surprised smile. It wasn't a shy smile anymore. It was a look of pure joy. She stood up on the bench, because she was too short to be seen over the piano, and bowed awkwardly. As she bowed, the cheering got even louder. A man near the front whistled loudly. Maya laughed, a small, happy sound that was lost in the noise of the crowd. But her mother saw it from the wings. Ilara was standing in the shadows, tears streaming down her face, making her makeup run. She wasn't wiping them anymore. She didn't care about her messy uniform or her tired shoes. She was clapping her hands together until they stung. Her heart felt like it would burst with pride. She saw the way the audience looked at her daughter not as a poor kid in a thrift store dress, but as a star. She saw the judges smiling, really smiling, for the first time all day. All the sacrifices, the long nights, the extra shifts at the diner, the worry about money, it all felt worth it in this moment. The applause went on for a long time. Usually at these competitions, the clapping died down after 10 or 15 seconds. But this time, it went on and on. The people didn't want to leave. They wanted to tell Maya that she had moved them. They wanted to thank her for sharing something real. Finally, Maya had to leave the stage because the next contestant needed to come out. She gave one last wave, hopped off the bench, and carefully walked around the piano to the side of the stage. As she stepped into the wings, the roar of the crowd followed her. Echoing off the walls backstage, the man with the clipboard was standing there. He wasn't looking tired or bored anymore. He was looking at Maya with a look of wonder. He didn't check his paper. He didn't say next, just gave her a little nod of respect and moved aside to let her pass. As Maya walked back down the hallway toward her mother, the atmosphere had changed completely. The other contestants who were waiting looked at her differently now. They stepped back to let her pass. They looked at her with awe. The arrogant boy stepped in front of her. For a second, Maya thought he was going to block her way, but instead he stopped and looked at his shoes. "I'm sorry I laughed," he mumbled, barely loud enough to hear. "You play better than anyone I know." Maya just smiled at him. "Thank you," she said softly. She didn't hold a grudge. She was too happy. Her mother swept her up into a hug. It was a tight, squeezing hug that smelled like fried food from the diner and lavender soap. "You did it, baby," Alara whispered into Maya's hair. "You did it. Did they like it, Mom?" Maya asked, pulling back to look at her mother's face. "They loved it, Maya. They really loved it." Maya's mother grabbed her hand. "Come on, we have to get back to our seats for the awards. They are going to call your name." They walked back into the auditorium, but this time, nobody stared at their clothes. Heads turned to watch Maya walk down the aisle to her seat. People smiled at her as she passed. A few reached out to pat her shoulder gently, as if touching her might give them some of the magic she had on stage. The music professor, the man with the gray beard, stopped her. He didn't say anything, but he took Maya's small hand in his large, wrinkled one, and kissed the top of it, like a knight greeting a princess. He had tears in his eyes. They sat back down in their cheap seats near the back. The rest of the competition went on, but the energy in the room had shifted. It felt lighter. The other contestants played well, but it was hard to listen to them the same way. They played with skill, but Maya had played with soul. She had changed the game when the competition was finally over. The judges walked onto the stage to announce the winners. Mrs. Gable stood at the microphone. She looked different now. She looked softer. "This was a very difficult decision," Mrs. Gable said into the mic, her voice echoing through the hall. "We heard many talented young people today, but very rarely in our lives do we hear something that touches us so deeply that we cannot speak. Today we heard that." The room went quiet. Everyone knew who she was talking about. "The winner of this year's Grand City Piano Competition," Mrs. Gable continued, "and the recipient of the gold medal is Maya." The applause that followed was not a shock. It was a celebration. It was the sound of a room full of people agreeing that talent doesn't care about money or age. It was the sound of a little girl who was taken seriously. Maya stood up. Her mother was crying again, hugging her tight. "Go get your medal," her mother whispered. Maya walked down the aisle toward the stage, walking past all the people who had underestimated her. She walked with her head high, her shoes squeaking on the floor. She climbed the steps onto the stage, past the shiny black piano that had been her best friend that day. Mrs. Gable handed her a large gold medal on a blue ribbon. It was heavy and shiny. As Maya put it over her head, it slipped down and rested against her chest, right over her heart. The crowd stood up again, clapping and cheering. Maya stood center stage, the heavy gold medal shining on her flowered dress. She looked out at the sea of people, then down at her small hands, then up at the lights. She smiled the biggest, brightest smile she had ever smiled. She wasn't the invisible girl anymore. She wasn't the weird girl. She was a musician. And she knew that no matter how small she was, as long as she had her voice, she would always be heard.